Welcome everyone to Miscellaneous Lecture 3. This is something of a special request because several people have asked me what the Chancellor of the Exchequer will be doing in the next budget, bearing in mind what a difficult time we're going through. This will be the budget that is announced in 2021. So what I'm going to do is explain to you what Rishi, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, will do and what he should do in the budget, which are obviously two different things. Now, when we use the word budget, all we're doing is referring to the revenue that government gets and how they're going to spend over the next year. That's the plan of what they're doing. I'm actually concerned a little more with the way that the budget is used as fiscal policy. Now, this is something that has only happened since World War II. I'll explain why. Before World War II, before 1939, budgets were just budgets. That is, the government planned to spend a certain amount of money and would finance that with taxation. After the Second World War, along come the theories which explain that the government can do much more than that, and they can use their budget as a fiscal policy to manage the overall level of aggregate demand in the economy. And I'm going to explain that to you as best I can, and out of this will come an explanation of what Rishi will do, and then I'll obviously finish off by telling you what he should be doing, which is something totally different. The economist John Maynard Keynes, I've used this in other lectures, so my apologies if you've seen this in other lectures, but the economist John Maynard Keynes said this: "The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else." Now, I've used this in the past to highlight the word wrong, but in this case I really just want to highlight the fact that the world is ruled by little else. It's theories, ideas from clever people that rule the world, and it is governments and government departments that just try and manifest policies around these particular ideas and theories. We can of course go back and remind ourselves that these could be wrong as well as right, because I'm going to explain why Rishi and the Treasury base their decision upon theories that are wrong, and if we wanted to base them upon theories that are right, then we should do something completely different. So the idea is to really understand the background, what it is that's behind all the policies that are made. And if you can understand what the Treasury looks at as it's trying to understand ideas and what to do, you'll understand more clearly what will happen. And I'm not going to deal with the minutiae of the budget, that we're going to raise this tax, lower this tax, increase spending here, reduce spending here. My concern is with the broad aggregates, and you'll understand why after I've continued this explanation. So to understand what Rishi will do, we need to understand the assumptions that the Treasury accepts, and then the theories that are built on those assumptions, and therefore the theories upon which decisions will be based. There are obviously lots of economists with lots of different ideas about what should happen in the economy, but the economists who are listened to are the ones who actually tell government what they want to hear. And basically governments want to hear that they can spend more money. So the theories that are accepted, listened to and acted upon are the theories which say, yes, government, you can spend more money. Now, the assumptions that the Treasury takes as given, upon which it's going to build this budget and this fiscal policy, are as follows. They accept the idea that in the economy there's an output gap, And the output gap is theoretically nice and easy to understand. The output gap is what the size of the economy could be if everyone was working, if it was fully employed. The income, output and expenditure in the economy would be this number. If there are people unemployed, if we're not producing at this full capacity, then we've got an output gap. We've got a gap that could be filled with the model that the Treasury accepts by stimulating aggregate demand, which is stimulating the total demand in the economy, which could be giving consumers more money to spend. It could be encouraging producers to invest more. It could be doing a number of things, all of which are concerned with expanding the total amount of demand in the economy. Now, they also accept that sort of either side, if you like, of this output gap, there's at the top end a full employment equilibrium, that there is a point at which you can't really expand the economy past that point. When all resources are fully employed, that's as far as you can go. And there's less than full employment situations, or equilibriums as they call them, which are the ones where you settle in with high unemployment and output lower than you could achieve. And what has been pointed out in the past is that these under full employment equilibriums are fairly stable and won't go away, or at least governments have been told that they're stable and won't go away until the government does something about it, until the government stimulates aggregate demand. Also, we've always got this problem of inflation, and the assumption is that as long as we're at less than full employment, we've not achieved full employment capacity, then we can't have inflation because we haven't got excessive demand. At least we can't have demand pull inflation. We have, however, noticed inflation taking place with less than full employment, so we have to have another assumption here, and that inflation is not demand pull inflation. It's not excessive demand or too much demand in the economy. In fact, it can occur with too little demand in the economy, and it's called cost push inflation. So this is where at any level of employment, costs get pushed up and cause the inflation. I suppose I must say here, I'll explain later, but there's no such thing as cost push inflation. This is one of those things that's been made up in order to allow this theory to be used and continually reused. So demand stimulation in the economy would just occur through fiscal policy. That is, if we wanted to expand demand in the economy, we would spend more money and we wouldn't raise taxes to finance it. The demand stimulation through fiscal policy is usually associated with an accommodating monetary policy. That is, if we're trying to expand the economy through more government spending, we would like an accommodating monetary policy with lower interest rates, with an increase in the quantity of money. So there is this assumption that you can accommodate an expansionary fiscal policy with your monetary policy. And there's something called the Phillips curve, which is just a trade-off between inflation and employment levels. And if you want higher employment levels, you may have to suffer a little bit more inflation. And if you want higher unemployment levels, which no one wants, you're going to get less inflation. And there's an idea of something called the NAIRU, which is the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Now we'll go through these, but those are the sort of assumptions that the Treasury has. And this doesn't only apply to the UK economy, it's exactly the same in America. The government and the Fed will have these same assumptions in the background when they formulate their policies, and the same for the ECB and the European Parliament as well. So those assumptions have been the background to the Treasury models that have been used to predict what would happen if we do this, if we do this, if we do this. If you go right back 50 years, the government had quite a nice, what was called a national input-output matrix. If I remember correctly, it was something like 40 columns and 40 rows. 1,600 cells, is that? Probably. I actually used it myself because it is a national input-output matrix. So when as a postgraduate I was doing research, I worked out how to use the national input-output matrix and add a regional aspect to it by adding one more column and one more row that could be applied to any region and allow you to pick out the effect that you might have on employment in a region or incomes in a region if something particular happened. I actually did look at the Channel Tunnel and the setup of the Channel Tunnel and the impact it had upon shipping. But that's another story, we won't go down there. But what it was as a model was something that moves you from one static position to another. I just changed one number in the cells, followed through the columns and rows until we got another new position, one static position to another static position. The Treasury model has became much more sophisticated because it became dynamic. It became something that wasn't a static movement from one static position to another. It was a dynamic model, the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model, DSGE, a very complicated model, but it wasn't one that ever produced particularly good predictions about anything in the economy, which is an indication that it might not have been based upon the right assumptions. In fact, I do remember talking to Charles Goodhart of Goodhart's Law when he was influential at the Bank of England and the Treasury, and I was mentioning to him how bad these predictions were, and he did say yes. He said it's a beautiful model. It's mathematically very attractive, but yes, its predictions are always way out and wrong. And I tried to explain to him that it wasn't the mathematical modelling. I have no problem with the mathematical modelling behind these Treasury models. My question is all about the assumptions. The assumptions are wrong, so you can do as much modelling and prediction as you like. If you've got the wrong assumptions, you won't get the right answers. So these Treasury models have changed and developed into different models, and they're quite complex to explain, but there is a fairly simple way where I will sort of try and explain things, and obviously I'll be criticised for being too simplistic, but hopefully you will understand this and it will give you some idea of the modelling that will be behind the decisions that will be made at the Treasury and the policies therefore that Rishi will bring to bear in the next budget. And we can go all the way back to John Maynard Keynes, because it was John Maynard Keynes who looked at the Great Depression and said we can do something better than what we have been doing in the past, and so he explained and introduced what were called counter-cyclical policies. So what Keynes was saying was that capitalist economies tend to move from highs to lows, from booms to depressions, through cyclical events, trade cycles, and the government actually reinforces these cycles by their actions. When you've got a boom, then more people are employed, incomes are rising, more taxes are paid, government revenues increase, and governments spend more money reinforcing the boom, making the boom bigger. And then when you move into a recession, unemployment rises, income falls, tax revenues fall, so governments cut their spending because they've got less tax coming in, and therefore they make the depression worse. So that was the basis upon which Keynes was working, and he said, why don't governments do the very opposite of what the market economy is doing? When we have a boom, why doesn't the government take some demand out of the economy? Budget for a surplus, raise taxes and don't spend it all. So you reduce the amount of demand in the economy, not increase it during the boom period. And when you move into a recession and a depression, then governments are getting less income to spend. That's when you budget for a deficit. You actually expand government spending and don't increase taxes, or you can reduce taxes and keep the same level of spending, but governments need to boost the economy during that time. And so what he was saying is government should act in a counter-cyclical way against the cycle, not move with the cycle, they move against the cycle. And those two arrows here and here, if you like, are saying condense this amplitude of these cyclical events and you will have a much more stable economy which will be more conducive to growing. So that was the whole theory behind Keynesian economics, and it was, the Keynesian model, if you like, and it was the predominant model that was used in creating budgets and fiscal policy from World War II right up until 1979, when the Tory government under Margaret Thatcher and lots of other people said, yeah, it doesn't actually work, does it? We've tried it for a very long time and it doesn't actually work. So they abandoned it for a little while, but it did come back again after the global financial crisis in 2007-8, so that in 2009 we went back into a Keynesian world of boosting fiscal policies as quickly as we could to try and expand economies, and it became something of a worldwide phenomenon after a G20 meeting in London in March 2009, when all countries agreed that they would use the sort of fiscal stimulus, the fiscal boost to get the world economy back on track. As you can imagine, didn't work, but more about that in a minute. I'll explain why it didn't work and why it has never worked, despite the fact it sounds like a jolly good idea, doesn't it? The problem you have with what Keynes was saying was that only half of it is what governments want to hear. Governments are quite happy to hear budget for a deficit, because budget for a deficit means they can cut taxes, they can spend more money. Double whammy when it comes to collecting votes, raising spending, cutting taxes. What they didn't want to listen to was the idea of the budget surplus, because the budget surplus meant that they got to cut the government expenditure and or raise taxes. Neither of those things are good vote-catching policies. So there was always a disinclination to budget for surpluses, but great support for budgeting for deficits. So Keynesians, if you like, the people who followed Keynes, not Keynes himself, but the people who followed Keynes, they sort of reinterpreted Keynes in a way that almost allowed continuous fiscal stimulation of the economy. So we tend to have budget deficit after budget deficit because they tended to move along the lines of a bigger budget deficit was expansionary and a smaller budget deficit wasn't. They were, of course, tripped up by inflation, because inflation did occur during periods of time when unemployment was higher than they would like it to be. So this is where they had to invent another cause for inflation, which they called cost-push inflation. And cost-push inflation is quite easy to pull the wool over people's eyes. You tell people oil prices are rising, wages are going up too quickly, commodity prices are rising, the exchange rate is falling, import prices are rising. These things push up prices, don't they? Everyone nods their head. And in fact, probably about 90% of economists nod their head and think this is right, but it isn't. Because by definition, inflation is always more units of money used in the same number of transactions. Can't be anything else. More units of money used in the same number of transactions. Higher oil prices, higher commodity prices, falling exchange rates don't increase the number of units of money in the economy. They can't cause inflation. They do change relative prices. Some go up, some go down, but they don't change the average level of prices. They don't cause inflation. So cost push inflation is a mistake as far as I'm concerned, but it's the one thing that allowed Keynesian economists to always be explaining why governments have got to spend more money, which is exactly what governments want to hear. And if you look over the last 70 years, I think you've probably got something like 4 or 5 budget surpluses and 65 or 66 deficits. Whereas if Keynes had been listened to and we were pursuing Keynesian policies, then over the last 60 years you'd expect to have roughly 30 surpluses and 30 deficits. But we never had that because Keynesians interpreted Keynes somewhat differently. Now, Keynesian economics isn't something that you really talk about in a loud voice these days. People don't really want to be known as Keynesian economists because everyone will start asking them questions about how things always went wrong when you tried to use these policies. So governments have looked as well towards other theories, other ideas, which would again do what they want, which is allow them to spend more money. So a sort of growing and popular idea is modern monetary theory. Modern monetary theory is something which uses Keynesian assumptions, and it explains to governments why they need to keep spending more and more money. On my blog I've got 4 articles explaining why modern monetary theory is wrong, and they do have some rather strange ideas, thinking of government spending as what creates money in the economy, and taxation which destroys money in the economy. All incorrect. That's all just fiscal policy. The monetary policy is what they're talking about. They're trying to conflate the two and confuse people. But what again they're telling governments is they can spend more money. There's no problem. You can spend more money right up to the point at which you would hit a full employment position, and you can't carry on past that point because you will then get inflation, which is more or less what the Keynesian economists will say. My good mate Steve Keen is developing his Minsky model, which is a much more complex and targeted model about the way in which macroeconomics should be managed, but again it uses these assumptions that are wrong, and therefore the outcome of any Keynesian modern monetary theory Minsky modelling will produce the same wrong answers. But all of them, the ideas are sort of politically kosher as they encourage governments to spend more money. And so they are the background, if you like, of what governments have been doing for the last 70 years and what will bring Rishi into his pomp in the next budget. Let me just explain. There's an extreme Keynesian model which is again very simple to see, and I will try and explain it to you now. And then there's a less extreme Keynesian model which I'll mention as well for obvious reasons, because I want to show the idea of the Phillips curve as well, which is based upon a Keynesian model, not an extreme Keynesian model. But think of the economy just as the two things, demand and supply. On the vertical axis there, AP, you're measuring average prices. So there's a pound note sign because we're doing it for the UK economy, but you can do it for any economy you like. So we've got an aggregate demand function which says that if prices are higher, people would buy less. If prices fall, people will buy more. And we've got an aggregate supply function, which is how much can be supplied in the economy at any and all points in time. And on the horizontal axis, we're looking at actually the output of the economy. It's RGDP, real gross domestic product, but it's the output of the economy that you're looking at on the horizontal axis, and just average prices on the vertical axis. And AD crosses AS at what's called YE there. Now YE is an under full employment equilibrium. And you can see to the right of it YF, which would be the full employment equilibrium. And it's quite easy to think about the difference between these two things, because if we've got, say, 3 million people unemployed and we think that 2 million of those could be employed, if we took, say, the average salary, multiplied it by 2 million, we go, oh, that's the amount of extra demand we need in the economy to employ these 2 million people and move us from YE to YF, moving us from less than full employment, YE, to full employment, YF. So all we've got to do is stimulate aggregate demand, moving AD to AD1, and we have solved all of our problems. And indeed, this is an extreme example because it suggests that as you increase demand and you're not at full employment, then you won't get any inflation. Average prices stay the same. There will come a point, right out here, this point here, where you just couldn't stimulate the economy anymore. It's absolutely everything working at full capacity, and if you try to, then you get your inflation, you get your demand pull inflation. So if I carried on moving AD across here, when I came to at this point here, all I would just get is more and more inflation on this axis here. But what the extreme Keynesian case says, if you've got unemployment, you've got an output gap, and you've got an output gap that can be closed by stimulating aggregate demand and moving you from an under full employment equilibrium, YE, to a full employment equilibrium, YF. Now, because you do tend to get a bit of inflation when you do this, then the less extreme Keynesians said, no, well, perhaps it's more like this rather than like that, that we've got our original equilibrium position here where AD crosses AS, and we've got an equilibrium YE. And if we want to move towards a fuller level of employment, we're going to have to accept some inflation. So AD goes to AD1, and you get a growth in output, and you get some inflation. So inflation goes up from the average price AP to the average price AP1. So this accepts, if you like, that there is some link between higher levels of employment and a bit more inflation in the economy, and that allows us to explain what actually happened when governments pursued these policies of manipulating aggregate demand, because they tended to get more inflation, and the Phillips curve explained that. Or did it? No, in fact it didn't. This is the Phillips curve, and this is still talked about by politicians. Janet Yellen, when she was leader of the Fed, and of course she's back in favour now, kept talking about the Phillips curve. And the Phillips curve is this. The Phillips curve looks at what would happen when you move towards 100% employment in the economy. So 0% would be down this end, and then right up to 100% employment at that end, and then anywhere along here would be levels of unemployment and employment as you move in this direction here. And vertically, when you move above this point, you have inflation, and below this point here you have deflation. And what the Phillips curve says, that if you try and boost demand in the economy, you're going to get more employment, and you're going to get some more inflation as well. That there's a trade-off between more employment and more inflation. So PC is the Phillips curve there, and there's a little spot there which I've said is NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, thought to be around 2% at the moment. So it's all nicely explained on a Phillips curve how we can manipulate aggregate demand in the economy and achieve our targets for employment, but here accepting just a little bit of inflation as well. Unfortunately, as with cost-push inflation, there's no such thing. This isn't the Phillips curve. Bill Phillips, A.W. Phillips, he developed his curve relating employment levels to demand in the economy. So his trade-off was between employment levels and manipulating the amount of demand in the economy. And what he said was that when employment was very high, you tended to get higher wages, and when employment was low or unemployment was high, you tended to get a fall in wages. So the Phillips curve was all about wages, not prices. Of course, if you're a Keynesian economist, you can sort of say, well, wages are prices, aren't they? Because we believe in cost-push inflation, don't we? But of course, that's all right. So what Bill Phillips was saying was that if you had an economy which was near full employment, then people, if they wanted to employ people, would have to bid for those people from other employers. So that will push up wages. But if you had a big pool of unemployment, then you could all get your staff from the unemployed pool, and wages were much lower. You could bid for people at a much lower wage. That's all the Phillips curve was, and the Phillips curve got sort of misunderstood by Keynesian economists, or at least they thought they could use it to highlight a trade-off between inflation and employment levels, whereas in actual fact it was a trade-off between wages and employment levels. And again, it doesn't work. 1970s in the UK was a great illustration of that, because as you boosted demand during the 70s, you actually got inflation, but you also got rising unemployment as well. That word stagflation explains that, doesn't it? And I'll talk a little bit more about stagflation in a minute. So all of this underpins Treasury thinking, government thinking, Bank of England thinking, and this is what will be bubbling around as Rishi forms his next budget and we go to the sort of next stage in fiscal policy. So if you understand all of that, you've got an idea of what Rishi will do in the next budget, because if you accept all of those assumptions and all of those things, then you know that Rishi is going to look at the situation over the previous year and go, there's an enormous supply shock in the economy. Unemployment is rising because of the pandemic, and the output gap is increasing. There's a bigger gap now between what we could achieve if everyone was employed and what we are actually going to achieve. And being a one-trick pony with no other thoughts in mind, the solution will be this requires further fiscal stimulation. In other words, we've got to expand government spending, and we mustn't raise taxes to cover it, or we mustn't raise taxes to cover all of it. And indeed, at the time of this budget, which was being sort of thought about in great detail at this moment, there's no worrying inflation in the economy. And there is inflation in the economy, around 1%, but there's nothing to worry about inflation at the moment. The reason for that is the cause of the inflation, it's all there. It's all built up in a big stock of monetary expansion that has taken place. But monetary demand in the economy has been suppressed by lockdown, and that's kept the speed at which you're passing money on from person to person, which is called the velocity of circulation of money. That's kept that down. So if you went straight out of lockdown now into total normality, whatever that may be, then that V number would increase. People would be spending a lot more money, going out, enjoying themselves, making up for lost time, whatever it is, and we would then get quite a boost to demand, which will eventually come through in inflation. But that isn't happening at the moment. So at the time of the budget, Rishi can explain to others, others can explain to Rishi that it's all right for fiscal stimulation because there's no inflation. Inflation, unfortunately, has a sort of lagged effect of perhaps a year to 18 months, even 2 years, depending upon what the circumstances are, so you can often separate what you do now from the inflation that you cause in the future. So we're probably going to look, as a result of this pandemic, at a borrowing requirement next year, which is just 1 year's requirement for borrowing money, at about £300 billion, and a national debt that will be growing to sort of 2.23 trillion pounds. Big numbers here, but because we've got the supply shock and the growing output gap, we've still got scope to stimulate fiscally again. So this output gap will lead to more government spending announced in the budget, and no, it won't be financed from taxation. In fact, it can't be financed from taxation because taxation will actually have been falling, with unemployment rising over the period of the pandemic. Is now above 5% and still going up. Once furlough stops, it'll continue on higher. So what you've got is less tax coming in, and indeed more benefits expenditure having to go out to the unemployed people who receive benefits when they're unemployed. So what we'll have is then another big borrowing requirement next year. And the government may try and persuade you that no, this is not a big borrowing requirement because it's smaller than last year. And it's often a sort of trick of just before budgets. If people are worried that there's going to be another big borrowing requirement, let us suppose you're worried that next year's borrowing requirement might be £250 billion, then that would shock everyone if that was announced in the budget. So once again, some economists will estimate that next year's borrowing requirement will be as high as £300 billion again. So in the budget, we'll then be able to reduce it to £250 billion instead of being all shocked by that number. We'll go, thank goodness, that's not as big as we thought it was going to be. But you know, that's another matter. But this borrowing requirement, because it can't be financed from taxation, it'd be difficult to finance from borrowing, will lead to government debt being unsold at the Bank of England, which will be more money printing, which once inflation starts to pick up towards the end of 2021, it will continue on into 2022, 2023, because it's being fueled by what Rishi will do in the next budget. Words like austerity will be used, that we're coming out of a period of austerity. Lots of economists have been arguing there's been austerity for the last decade or more. There hasn't, of course. All there has been is profligacy, more and more, or more and less, but always profligate. The budget deficits are always there. They're smaller and bigger. Smigger's a nice word, isn't it? They're smaller and bigger, but they're there. They're expansionary. My students, just to help them get their head around this, I often give an illustration. My wife's very sort of spendthrift, whereas I'm not quite like that. So I say, look, suppose I ran up a debt on my credit card this year of £10,000. My wife finds out, and I have to explain that this debt has grown rather large, this borrowing requirement to £10,000. I probably have been out enjoying myself in the bars and pubs and down the betting shop a little more than I should have done, but I'm going to change. Next year I've planned some big cuts. I'm going to stop having newspapers and magazines delivered, and I estimate that will save us at least £500 next year. So next year my borrowing requirement will only be £9,500. And my wife will say, oh, that's a step in the right direction, isn't it? So what will your credit card debt be at the end of the year? And I say, well, it'll be then £19,500. And she'll say to me, no, I'm sorry, that's not austerity. That's just slightly less profligate next year than last year. Austerity is you reducing this credit card debt of £10,000 to less than £10,000. you're almost doubling it, and you're saying because I'm not quite doubling it, then that's austerity, isn't it? Making cuts. And I will say, well, yes, I agree with you. I should be trying to cut it, but I can't do that because there are people whose jobs depend upon me borrowing money and spending money. The local pubs, the local bars, the local restaurants, the local betting shops. They'll be out of jobs if I don't carry on with this high level of spending. And so next year, I'm not talking about austerity. I'm talking about less profligacy. And that's exactly what Rishi will deliver. It won't be austerity next year. It'll be just less profligate. We'll be adding less money to the national debt than we added the previous year, but we're still adding it. It's still growing. It's still expanding. So it will be an expansionary budget. It just won't be quite as expansionary as last year's special budgetary and borrowing requirements caused by the pandemic. So that's what Rishi will do. So what will be the outcome of what Rishi does? Well, it'll be fiscal and monetary stimulation again. It'll cause inflation. Inflation is already being caused by what's happened last year, and it will start to rise in 2021 and continue to rise because there's going to be further fiscal expansion and monetary stimulation in the economy. Unemployment will tend to stay high because fiscal stimuluses, look back over the last 70 years, don't work. They actually distort markets, and there's no effective net job creation when government does this. I mean, there should be theoretically, but there just isn't. I mean, I have a crude, rough rule of thumb that for every job government creates, they destroy more than one job somewhere else in the economy because they create jobs inefficiently, and efficient jobs are lost in other parts of the economy. So we will have unemployment and we will have inflation. So we will have what we had towards the end of the 70s, stagflation. That will be the order of the day for the next couple of years. So the Treasury, the Bank of England, lost for any new ideas or accepting slight variations, accepting that perhaps Keynesian economics didn't work, but modern monetary theory might, or the Minsky model might. They'll still be doing the same thing, making the same mistakes, and it'll be repeated again in the next budget as well as this budget because there's no new ideas out there. Because the new ideas, the ones that could really work, and I'll explain them in just a moment, governments don't want to hear that. There are no votes, no immediate vote stimulation in doing the things that we really need to do to get the economy back on track. So to understand what Rishi is going to do and why it's wrong, let me just go back and say what's wrong in the models and assumptions that have been used to build all of these decisions. And you remember, I started with that, didn't I? And you see what the aggregate supply curve looks like there. It's horizontal before it becomes vertical at full employment. It's not really like that. That's what it's really like. In the long run, it's just a vertical aggregate supply curve. It cuts an aggregate demand curves and gives you your average price, AP. And if I want to stimulate demand in the economy, all I'm going to do is get inflation. AD will go to AD1 and that will be recorded as higher inflation. It won't do anything to the output of the economy. Even though I've recognised there's a YF, there's certainly an output gap there, but stimulating demand won't do anything about it. In fact, what we have at YE here is just what's called a natural level of employment or a natural level of unemployment, whichever way you want to look at it, which is why I've said sort of YEN. It's just the natural level, and all economies just have a natural level of employment, which is dependent upon the institutions that there are in those economies. And they can all be different from one economy to another. Let me just give you one quick example of why that might be the case. If an economy had very high welfare benefits, paid lots of people high welfare benefits for not working, then there will be a much higher natural level of unemployment than there would be if an economy offered nothing in the way of welfare benefits. In other words, if you don't work, you don't survive. And in that country, the natural level of unemployment would be very low, or the natural level of employment would be very high. So that's what the economy really looks like. And the last 70 years have shown this. You haven't really been able to increase the overall level of jobs in the economy and sustain it by manipulating aggregate demand. All you do is build up inflation. Now, I'm saying there is an output gap, but because manipulating demand has no effect, the only thing that you could do to move yourself from YE to YF, a full employment situation, is shift the supply curve to the right. That is, you need stimulation, supply side stimulation of the economy, which could move out. I mean, an obvious example, just bearing in mind what I said, is scrap all welfare benefits and straight away you'll close that output gap. And in order not to cause prices to fall, I have deflation, you would then need an accommodating expansion in aggregate demand. But it's the other way around here. It's not monetary policy that's accommodating fiscal policy. It's a fiscal accommodation of supply side policies which involve no demand stimulation in the first instance. So this is the correct model, simple model of an economy, the one that the Treasury should look at when it's trying to make its decisions, not one where there's a Phillips curve, there's a trade-off between inflation and employment levels, there's no such thing as demand pull inflation unless we're at full employment and so on. That's all wrong. This is what's right. So what you're saying for the actual economy is it's aggregate supply, which is the thing that could be managed well and is actually mismanaged, which causes output gaps to be larger than they are. If you want to close these output gaps, then you've got to shift this supply curve outwards to the right, not manipulate demand. And in fact, any demand stimulation, any demand that's growing faster than the rate of growth of output will just be inflation. And all inflations are excessive demand pull inflations, if you like. Cost push inflation is just a myth. It doesn't exist. And it's a nice logical argument you can have with anyone, and just finish off by saying, now, I'm sorry, all inflations are more units of money used in the same number of transactions, QED. That's finished the argument, isn't it? You cannot have cost push inflation. So every single inflation you have is because there's too much demand in the economy. Even now, with the pandemic, we have 1% inflation. That 1% inflation is because there is too much demand in the economy. Not too little, too much demand. It doesn't matter what the unemployment level is. If you've got inflation, it's too much demand at that level of employment. And all inflations are exactly that, too much monetary demand. So this leads us to what should Rishi do? Now, I'm going to give you the whole lot here. This is what Rishi should do. Any little bits of this would be helpful. None of this will happen, of course, because what he's going to do is what I've already told you. So he's going to offer a smaller borrowing requirement next year, because there won't be any furlough expenditures, hopefully, as we've got out of the pandemic. We're aiming to get out just about the time of the budget, aren't we? So things will get back to normal then. So we'll have another output gap to be closed with fiscal stimulation and not enough revenue coming in, so another large borrowing requirement. That's what will happen. But this is what should happen. Cut government spending. I mean, all government spending on the pandemic issue should go. And well, we could have finance the pandemic in a much cheaper way. I won't go into this one yet, but if you want to go to my blog, you can read about, there's something in there called Pandemic 2020, Look Back in Anger, where I pretend that I'm in 2022 and look back and say, you did it all wrong, didn't you? You should have done this. But it could have been done a lot more cheaply than it was, but it was not done on the cheap, so you can cut all that. You can reduce government spending. As always, I think you can reduce government spending on the National Health Service and on the educational bureaucracies. And at the same time, you can increase spending on the frontline workers. You know, the people who really do the work in education and health, the frontline workers, you can have more of those. Let's cut expenditure on this wasteful bureaucracy that we have in the National Health Service and in education. And we can do it simply by just changing from a policy which measures process to one which just looks at outcomes. You don't have to measure the process in every single hospital and every single school. Total waste of time. You know, schools know what is a good outcome. Hospitals know what is a good outcome with a certain variation across a range. And it's quite easy to identify if there's one school out of 10,000 or one hospital out of 2,000 that's not performing properly. You investigate that. You don't investigate all hospitals to stop that one thing happening. So, you know, I would get rid of a lot of spending on the bureaucracies around the National Health Service and the educational bureaucracies. If you listened in the last lecture where I explained how we could change the tax system, I like Rishi to do it in this budget, which is just to have 3 rates of income tax, which is a stepped progression from a reverse income tax to actual progressive income taxes. I'd only have 2 expenditure taxes, which is VAT, and to manipulate demerit goods I'd have excise duty, and I'd get rid of the rest. There's no point in having corporation tax, so we'd get a lot more revenue in this country if we didn't have any corporation tax and attracted loads of other firms from other parts of the world employing more people, paying more taxes. I get rid of national insurance, that's a nuisance. Inheritance tax, I forget that, because wealth I'm not bothered about at all. I couldn't care less if there are wealthy people and it's unequal. My concern is with the standard of living and the equality or the unequalness around income, and you can deal with that without having to bother about wealth. I get rid of capital gains tax, I get rid of stamp duty. So let's have a nice simplified system, spending a lot less and taxing much more efficiently. And in fact, I would be aiming as quickly as possible. It may take another year or more to achieve this, but I would aim for the balanced budget. The budget which says this is government spending and this is how we're going to finance it through taxation this year. And you can't do it precisely every year, so I'd say balanced over a 3-year term. You could never persuade politicians that they need a balanced budget, because balanced budgets don't go with votes. So I would have to impose a law which says that governments have got to balance their budget over a 3-year term. So politicians can go, yes, we'd like to spend a lot more money, but the law doesn't allow it. That's the easiest way out of that one. And in fact, part of this law would say that government can't borrow any money at all until the national debt to GDP ratio falls below 25%. I'll throw out there as a number at the moment. Before last year it was nearer 60-70%, and after this year's pandemic it'll be about 100%. So no more borrowing until you've got the national debt under control and yearly borrowing requirements under control, and the national debt to GDP ratio falls below 25%. So I throw it all at you. That's what I would like Rishi to do in the next budget. I've explained to you why he won't do that. I've explained to you the theories behind all the decisions. When you're sitting around a table making these decisions in the aggregate, the sort of big numbers, then it's the Keynesian model, the models which argue for expansion in the economy, and the idea of output gaps that you can stimulate away by spending more money. All of these things will predominate, so you will have another large borrowing requirement, a lot more spending, and we haven't got the tax to finance it. The Bank of England will keep interest rates low to accommodate a large borrowing requirement, but it'll still be too large to be financed by borrowing from real people, so a proportion of it will be printed, which will then keep our inflation at much higher levels than we want. We will be well above our 2% target for the next few years. I think they've recognised that in America, so the Federal Reserve is already talking about we're going to have to adjust the inflation target number upwards. I think Andy Hall down at the Bank of England has already made reference to a nasty inflation coming. So there's a sort of background feeling that that this is coming, but it won't really hit people until it's here, and it will happen as this year unfolds. And if it doesn't happen, well, do stop listening to my lectures. If it does happen, please enjoy them. I'll come along with another lecture on another topic, which is, well, people might like to make requests and say, please, will you give us a lecture on this? Remind you, you've already got 10 lectures on economics, 10 on banking and finance, which would all be introductory lectures, and these are just taking you a little bit further into the applied field. How do these economic theories actually pan out in the real world? So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.